No one wanted him until she decided he mattered. They called it a labor auction, but everyone in the dusty main street of Red Hollow knew it was closer to a spectacle. Men stood on the rough plank stage like livestock, their wrists bound, their eyes hard or hollow. The sheriff claimed it was a way to settle debts for those who couldn't pay. But the truth was uglier. It was entertainment for people who liked to see the proud brought low. At the far end of the line stood the one they all whispered about. Broad-shouldered, hair and beard wild as the timberline, eyes the color of a storm over the mountains. No name anyone could agree on. Some called him Bear, others the Untamable. He hadn't spoken a word since they'd dragged him down from the high country 6 weeks ago. The story went that he'd fought off 3 deputies with nothing but his hands before they finally clubbed him from behind. The bidding for the others was half-hearted, $1 here, 2 there, until the auctioneer slapped his palm against the mountain man's shoulder. $3 to start, he barked, grinning at the crowd, though I reckon you'll be paying for trouble, not work. Laughter rippled through the onlookers. No one moved. No one wanted him. Not for $3, not for free. The silence stretched, and the mockery began. Maybe he'll eat your chickens, someone jeered. Maybe he'll eat you, another called. That was when she stepped forward. Clara Whitlock, the schoolteacher who'd come west 2 years ago with more books than friends, more stubbornness than sense. She'd been standing at the edge of the crowd, jaw tight, watching the way they looked at him, not like a man, but like a thing, and she'd had enough. $3, she said, her voice cutting clean through the heat and dust. Heads turned. The auctioneer blinked, then grinned wider. Sold to the lady in the blue dress. The laughter turned sharper now, tinged with disbelief. Clara walked to the stage, pressed 3 silver dollars into the auctioneer's hand, and met the mountain man's gaze. Up close, his eyes weren't just storm-colored. They were tired, wary, and something else she couldn't name. She didn't speak. Neither did he. But when the rope came off his wrists and she turned to lead him away, he followed. Behind them, the crowd buzzed with gossip. In front of them, the long road to her small cabin stretched under the blazing sun. Clara didn't know why she'd done it. She only knew that for the first time in months, she felt like she'd just made a choice that mattered. And somewhere deep in the silence between them, the mountain man's story and hers had just begun. The road from Red Hollow to Clara's cabin wound through open prairie before climbing into the low hills. The sun was still high, but the heat had settled heavy, pressing the smell of dust and sage into the air. Clara walked ahead, her boots crunching on the hard-packed earth, aware of the sound of his footsteps behind her, steady, unhurried, like a man who'd walked farther and harder than this 100 times before. She didn't look back often, but when she did, she noticed things. The way his eyes scanned the horizon, not nervously, but with the quiet alertness of someone who learned to survive by noticing what others missed. The way his hands stayed loose at his sides, even without the rope, as if he'd decided for now not to run. They passed a stand of cottonwoods where the shade pooled cool and deep. Clara stopped, partly to rest, partly to see what he'd do. He didn't sit. Instead, he crouched by the creek that ran shallow through the roots, cupped his hands, and drank. The water ran down through his beard, catching the light. "You've got a name?" she asked finally. He looked at her, not unkindly, but said nothing. She tried again. "I'm Clara." A pause. Then, so quiet she almost thought she imagined it, he said, "Elias." It was the first word she'd heard from him, and it landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward, changing the shape of the silence between them. They walked on. By the time they reached the split in the trail, the sun was lowering, painting the hills in gold and copper. Clara's cabin sat in a small clearing, a garden patch out front, a stack of firewood by the door. She pushed the door open, stepped inside, and gestured for him to follow. He paused on the threshold, eyes moving over the shelves of books, the worn quilt on the bed, the kettle on the stove. Then, without a word, he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Clara felt the air shift, not in danger, but in something else, something she couldn't name yet. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the steady sound of him moving quietly in the other room, she realized she wasn't afraid. She was curious. And curiosity, she knew, could be the start of anything. The next morning, Clara woke to the smell of wood smoke. For a moment she thought she'd dreamed it. She always lit the fire herself. But when she stepped into the main room, Elias was crouched by the stove, coaxing the flames with a patience that made the whole cabin feel warmer than the fire alone could manage. He didn't look at her when she entered, just shifted slightly so she could pass. On the table sat a tin mug of coffee, steam curling upward. She hadn't heard him grind the beans, hadn't heard the kettle boil. Somehow he'd moved through her space without a sound. They ate in silence, bread, a bit of cheese, nothing fancy. Clara found herself stealing glances at him, trying to read the lines of his face. There was a stillness to him that wasn't emptiness. It was contained, like a river under ice. After breakfast, she stepped outside to tend the garden. The wind had picked up, tugging strands of her hair loose from the knot at the back of her head. She was kneeling among the beans when she felt it, a shadow falling over her, the faint scent of pine and smoke. She turned, and Elias was there, holding something in his hand, a length of leather cord, worn smooth. Without a word, he gestured for her to sit on the porch step. Clara hesitated. No man had touched her hair since she'd left home, and certainly not one she'd known for less than a day. But there was no demand in his eyes, only a quiet question. She sat. Elias moved behind her, his hand surprisingly gentle as he gathered her hair. He worked slowly, fingers weaving the strands into a braid, so even and tight it felt like it might hold through a storm. When he reached the end, he tied it with the leather cord, gave a small nod she couldn't see, and stepped back. Clara touched the braid, feeling the weight of it. "Thank you," she said softly. He only inclined his head, then walked to the woodpile and began splitting logs as if nothing had happened. But something had. She could feel it. A thread pulled taut between them, invisible yet unbreakable. That night, as she lay in bed, she realized she hadn't asked him why he'd done it, and maybe she didn't need to. 3 days passed in a rhythm Clara hadn't known she'd been missing. Elias rose before dawn, splitting wood, hauling water, mending the fence without being asked. He still spoke little, sometimes not at all, but the silence between them had changed. It wasn't the wary quiet of strangers anymore. It was the kind that made space for thought, for noticing small things. The way he always left the last biscuit for her, The way he'd pause in his work when she read aloud on the porch as if the sound of her voice was something worth stopping for. But peace on the prairie never lasted long. It was late afternoon when Clara heard the crunch of wagon wheels on a hard dirt road. She stepped out onto the porch, shading her eyes against the low sun. A single rider was coming up the track instead. Sheriff Doolin, his badge catching the light, his expression unreadable. "Afternoon, Miss Whitlock," he called, reining in at the gate. His gaze slid past her to where Elias was stacking wood, shirt sleeves rolled, forearms corded with muscle. "I hear you took in the mountain man." Clara kept her voice even. "His name is Elias." The sheriff's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Name don't change the fact he's got a record. Folks in town are uneasy. Some say he's dangerous. Some say he's not right in the head." Elias didn't look up, but Clara saw the way his shoulders tightened. "What do you say, Sheriff?" she asked. "I say," Doolin replied, "that a man who won't speak for himself leaves other folks to do the talking, and talk has a way of turning ugly." He leaned forward in the saddle. "If you got nothing to hide, you won't mind me stopping by again." Maybe asking him a few questions, Clara met his gaze. "If you got questions, you can ask me." The sheriff studied her for a long moment, then tipped his hat. "Suit yourself. But don't say I didn't warn you." He turned his horse and rode back toward town, dust rising in his wake. When she looked back at Elias, he was watching the road, jaw set. She walked to him, but before she could speak, he shook his head once, not in anger, but in a way that said, "Not now." That night, the air in the cabin felt different, not colder exactly, but edged. Clara lay awake, listening to the wind in the eaves, wondering what the sheriff knew, and what Elias was still keeping locked behind his silence. The next 2 days passed under a thin veil of unease. Sheriff Doolin's visit had left a shadow in the cabin, one that neither Clara nor Elias named aloud. He worked harder than usual, as if the rhythm of the axe and the weight of the logs could drown out whatever thoughts the sheriff had stirred. Clara kept busy with her own chores, but she caught herself glancing toward the road more often, listening for the sound of hooves. One night she brought out the box of belongings they'd saved from the fire years ago, things she hadn't touched since her father died, letters burned at the edges, a photograph with her mother's face faded but still smiling, a coin from the war. The cowboy sat beside her, picked up each piece like it belonged to him, too. And when he reached the last item, a charred silver thimble, he closed her fingers around it and looked at her like the silence had finally said enough. She didn't cry, she just nodded, because when the world had shouted at her, punished her, and turned away, this man had held her without noise, without question. And somehow that silence had rebuilt more than any apology could. It was nearly dusk when the knock came, sharp, deliberate, and wrong. Clara stood from the forge stool, wiping soot from her palms as the cowboy stepped ahead of her, hand resting lightly on the knife tucked behind his belt. The door creaked open to reveal Reverend Alder, boots polished, collar starched, no trace of the man who'd swung the belt before God and a watching town. "I've come to speak," he said, voice clipped but low. The cowboy didn't move. Clara stepped forward. "To speak?" she repeated, "or to ask forgiveness?" The preacher looked past her into the dark corners of the cabin. "There are rumors, whispers of your defiance. The townsfolk are unsettled, are they?" she said coolly. "I wonder why." He shifted uncomfortably, Your return to the forge, the man beside you, the boy you carry. Stop there." Her voice snapped sharp as an anvil's strike. "You forfeited the right to speak of him the moment you raised your hand instead of your heart." The preacher's jaw tightened. "I acted on Scripture. You acted on fear." She folded her arms, felt the cowboy's presence just behind her, quiet, grounded, immovable. "You punished me to make others stay silent." "And yet here you are," he muttered, still standing, "because someone chose to hold me when no one else would." The Reverend's eyes flicked to the man at her side, something bitter flashing across his face. "He's not of this town." "Neither am I anymore," she replied. "I've outlived its judgment." The preacher sighed, stepped back. "Pride is a sin, Miss Gray." "And cowardice is a plague," she said, "one I've stopped inheriting." He left without blessing her, without apology, without even saying her name. But Clara smiled as she shut the door because, for once, she hadn't needed his permission to speak. The cowboy met her eyes, lifted one brow slightly. "He won't come back," she said. The man reached into the hearth's ashes, pulled a red coal with the tongs, and pressed it gently into the iron that would mold her new brand, one not of punishment, but of choice. And for the first time in her life, Clara Gray would carry a mark that meant she belonged to no one but herself. By the end of the week, Clara's name had turned from whispered shame to clenched jaw warning. Men passed her on the street and tipped their hats, not out of politeness, but because they didn't want to meet her eyes. The same mouths that called her harlot now muttered witch, or marked like silence had turned her dangerous. Maybe it had. Maybe the absence of her apology was louder than any sermon. She walked beside the cowboy every evening, past the well through the market, sometimes hand on her belly, other times resting against his arm like it had always been her place. He still never spoke, but folks talked enough for both of them. At the general store, the clerk fumbled the change, wouldn't meet her gaze. At the saloon, two ranch hands stopped mid-drink when she entered for sugar, as if seeing her unbroken threatened something they'd told themselves about women like her. And the worst of them all, Annabelle, the banker's niece, spoke loud enough for the front porch to hear. She didn't even say thank you. He risked his name for her, and she walks like she earned it. Clara turned slow and steady and stared straight through her. "He didn't give me anything I didn't already own," she said. "He just made it visible." That shut the porch up. The cowboy stood behind her, arms crossed, unmoved, his silence louder than fists. Later that night, as they sat on the porch swing, she'd rebuilt herself. She turned toward him and asked, "What do you see when they look at me like that?" He didn't answer with words. He reached into his pocket and handed her something wrapped in cloth. She unfolded it slowly. It was a broken nail, bent, burned, reshaped into a ring. Not perfect, not polished, but forged in fire and shaped by patience. Her fingers trembled. "This is—" She couldn't finish. He simply nodded. Not a proposal, not a claim, but a gesture. "You are not too ruined to be held." Clara didn't cry. She never had for pity, but her eyes shone, and she slipped the ring onto her finger without ceremony. The world had tried to silence her, but this man had taught her that silence could be strength, too, if it came from choice. And in that silence, she had finally begun to speak. The storm rolled in like it had a purpose, low skies, sharp wind, and thunder that sounded more like memory than weather. Clara's contractions began just after dusk. No warning, but the way her hand clutched the edge of the table and didn't let go. The cowboy didn't flinch. He built the fire higher, boiled water, stripped the bed with practiced hands. He didn't speak. He didn't pace. Just nodded when she said, "It's time," and stood beside her with the same stillness he'd offered from the first day. The wind howled like the town itself was trying to unmake her. But Clara didn't scream. She bore down, sweat soaking her brow, blood warming the blankets. And when her voice finally broke, when she cried out, not from pain but from power, he was there, hand steady beneath her knees, catching a life she had never once believed she'd earn. A boy, red-faced, furious, alive. Clara laughed, breathless, broken open in every way a woman can be, and pulled the child to her chest. "He looks like me," she whispered. The cowboy reached forward, brushed the baby's cheek with the back of his knuckle, and for the first time she saw his mouth form something close to a smile. "Will you name him?" she asked. He shook his head. She understood. This boy would carry no man's shame, no memory of a father who fled, no stain from the preacher's lash, only fire and quiet, and the steady silence of a man who had chosen to stay. "Then I'll name him after the wind," she said, "because it never breaks, even when the sky does." She didn't sleep that night, neither did he. They took turns holding the child, rocking him with no lullaby, but the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of thunder fading into dawn. Outside, the storm passed. The streets were washed clean. The town would whisper again, would invent new names for what they saw in her. But Clara wouldn't hear them, not anymore. She had built something louder, a life, a home, a child who came into this world wrapped not in shame, but in the warmth of a man who never said a word, but meant everything. 3 weeks after the birth, Clara returned to the town square, not to prove anything, not to confront ghosts, but because she wanted a lemon drop from the mercantile and refused to live like a fugitive in her own skin. She wore her hair unbound, the child strapped to her chest, and the silent man walking beside her with his usual slow, sure gait. People moved out of their way, not with hostility, but with hesitation, like giving space to a force of nature they couldn't understand. Outside the church, the doors remained shut. No bell rang, no sermon echoed. Reverend Alder hadn't spoken her name since the day she stood again. Rumor had it he'd requested transfer to a town in the east. Others said he stayed, but never preached of women again. Either way, she passed without pausing. She owed no prayer to walls that once punished her body in God's name. A child waved from the bakery window. Clara smiled. The small things were beginning to return. Later that evening, she laid the baby down beneath the cotton blanket she'd sewn from her father's shirts and watched the way he slept, mouth open, hands curled like he was still holding her heartbeat. "You think he'll understand?" she asked, not looking up. The cowboy didn't answer. He sat near the fire, carving something small between his fingers. She crossed the room, watched silently as the shape emerged. A horse, not perfect, but familiar. "My first toy was just like this," she said, tracing the grain. "My father made it the night my mother died." The cowboy looked at her, eyes soft beneath the shadow of his brow. She placed the carving beside the sleeping child, then turned back to him. "What you gave me," she said slowly, "wasn't rescue. It was a place to return to when no one else waited. He rose slowly and took her hand. For a moment, neither moved. There were no vows, no claims, but in that shared silence there was the steady pulse of something whole. He brushed his fingers against her cheek. She leaned into it, and outside, as twilight fell across the cabin and the forge grew quiet, the town forgot how to define her, but she remembered who she was. Years later, they would whisper about her like she'd been a myth. Some said she cast spells from her forge. Others said the cowboy who followed her like a shadow wasn't real at all, just a ghost conjured from her shame. But those who met her eyes, truly met them, knew the truth. She'd been broken publicly and rose without permission, not because someone fought for her, but because someone had stood beside her and refused to look away. The boy grew tall with her eyes and his silence. He'd asked once when he was 9 why no one ever spoke the cowboy's name. Clara had smiled, kissed his head, and said, "Because names don't make a man real. Deeds do." On her final day in the forge, she sealed one last iron brand, just a circle, unbroken, joined at both ends, and hung it above the door. Not for sale, not for use, just a symbol that even what's scarred can be whole. She didn't speak much in those years, not like before. She didn't need to. The world had heard her scream once, then it heard her rebuild. When she passed, it wasn't in a bed or under watch, it was in her swing. Child asleep on her lap, sun dipping behind a chapel she no longer feared, and beside her still sat the man who had never spoken a word. His hand rested on hers, his eyes never closed. When they buried her, no priest was called, just townsfolk with their hats in their hands, uncertain of what to say. But the boy spoke. She wasn't shamed, she was sacred, and with that he placed the broken nail ring, now worn thin, into her palm. They say the cowboy vanished after that, walked past the hills, never looked back, but the swing remained. So did the forge and the brand above the door, because the town didn't build her legacy. She did, not with noise, not with rage, but with silence, chosen, steady, sacred. She had been whipped in front of the church, but she had been held, truly held, by someone who didn't need to explain why she was worth it. And in the end, that was the loudest thing of all. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Echoes of the West and tell us in the comments, can silence say more than any vow?